The Devil by Guy de Maupassant. The peasant was standing opposite the doctor, by the bedside of the dying old woman, and she, calmly resigned and quite lucid, looked at them and listened to their talking. She was going to die, and she did not rebel at it, for her life was over. She was 92. The July sun streamed in at the window and through the open door and cast its hot flames onto the uneven brown clay floor, which had been stamped down by 4 generations of clodhoppers. The smell of the fields came in also, driven by the brisk wind and parched by the noontide heat. The grasshoppers chirped themselves hoarse, filling the air with their shrill noise, like that of the wooden crickets which are sold to children at fair time. The doctor raised his voice and said, "Honoré, you cannot leave your mother in this state. She may die at any moment." And the peasant, in great distress, replied, "But I must get in my wheat, for it has been lying on the ground a long time, and the weather is just right for it. What do you say about it, mother?" And the dying woman, still possessed by her Norman avariciousness, replied yes with her eyes and her forehead, and so urged her son to get in his wheat and to leave her to die alone. But the doctor got angry, and stamping his foot, he said, "You are no better than a brute, do you hear? And I will not allow you to do it. Do you understand? And if you must get in your wheat today, go and fetch Rapet's wife and make her look after your mother. I will have it. And if you do not obey me, I will let you die like a dog when you are ill in your turn. Do you hear me?" The peasant, a tall, thin fellow with slow movements, who was tormented by indecision, by his fear of the doctor and his keen love of saving, hesitated, calculated, and stammered out, "How much does La Rapet charge for attending sick people?" "How should I know?" the doctor cried. "That depends upon how long she's wanted for. Settle it with her, by Jove! But I want her to be here within an hour, do you hear?" So the man made up his mind. "I will go for her," he replied. "Don't get angry, doctor." And the latter left, calling out as he went, "Take care, you know, for I do not joke when I'm angry." And as soon as they were alone, the peasant returned to his mother and said in a resigned voice, "I will go and fetch La Rapet, as the man will have it. Don't go off while I'm away." And he went out in his turn. La Rapet, who was an old washerwoman, watched the dead and dying of the neighborhood, and then as soon as she'd sewn her customers into that linen cloth from which they would emerge no more, she went and took up her irons to smooth the linen of the living. Wrinkled like a last year's apple, spiteful, envious, avaricious with a phenomenal avarice, bent double as if she'd been broken in half across the loins by that constant movement of the iron over the linen, one might have said that she had a kind of monstrous and cynical affection for the death struggle. She never spoke of anything but of the people she'd seen die, of the various kinds of deaths at which she'd been present, and she related with the greatest minuteness details which were always the same, just like a sportsman talks of his shots. When Honoré Bontemps entered her cottage, he found her preparing the starch for the collars of the village women, and he said, "Good evening. I hope you're pretty well, Mother Rapet." She turned her head round to look at him. Fairly well, fairly well. And you?" "Oh, as for me, I am well as I could wish. But my mother is very sick." "Your mother?" "Yes, my mother." "What's the matter with her?" "She's going to turn up her toes, that's what's the matter with her." The old woman took her hands out of the water and asked with sudden sympathy, "Is she as bad as all that?" "The doctor says she will not last till morning." "Then she certainly is very bad." Honoré hesitated, for he wanted to make a few preliminary remarks before coming to his proposal, but as he could hit upon nothing, he made up his mind suddenly. "How much are you going to ask to stop with her till the end? You know that I'm not rich, and I cannot even afford to keep a servant girl. It is just that which has brought my poor mother to this state, too much work and fatigue. She used to work for 10 in spite of her 92 years. You don't find any maid of that stuff nowadays." La Rapet answered gravely, "There are 2 prices. 40 sous by day and 3 francs by night for the rich, and 20 sous by day and 40 by night for the others. You shall pay me the 20 and 40. But the peasant reflected, for he knew his mother well. He knew how tenacious of life, how vigorous and unyielding she was. He knew, too, that she might last another week in spite of the doctor's opinion, and so he said resolutely, "No, I'd rather you would fix a price unto the end. I will take my chance one way or the other. The doctor says she will die very soon. If that happens, so much the better for you, and so much the worse for me. But if she holds out till tomorrow or longer, so much the better for me, and so much the worse for you." The nurse looked at the man in astonishment, for she'd never treated a death as a speculative job, and she hesitated, tempted by the idea of the possible gain. But almost immediately she suspected that he wanted to juggle her. "Well, I can say nothing until I've seen your mother," she replied. "Then come with me and see her." She washed her hands and went with him immediately. They did not speak on the road. She walked with short, hasty steps, while he strode on with his long legs as if he were crossing a brook at every step. The cows, lying down in the fields, overcome by the heat, raised their heads heavily and lowed feebly at the two passers-by, as if to ask them for some green grass. When they got near the house, Honoré Bontemps murmured, "Suppose it is all over," and the unconscious wish that it might be so showed itself in the sound of his voice. But the old woman was not dead. She was lying on her back in her wretched bed, her hands covered with a pink cotton counterpane, horribly thin, knotty paws like some strange animal's, or like crab's claws, hands closed by rheumatism, fatigue, and the work of nearly a century which she had accomplished. La Rapette went to the bed and looked at the dying woman, felt her pulse, tapped her on the chest, listened to her breathing, and asked her questions so as to hear her speak. Then, having looked at her for some time longer, she went out of the room, followed by Honoré. His decided opinion was that the old woman would not last out the night, and he asked, "Well?" And the sick nurse replied, "Well, she may last 2 days, perhaps 3. You will have to give me 6 francs, everything included." 6 francs! 6 francs! He shouted. "Are you out of your mind? I can tell you she cannot last more than 5 or 6 hours." And they disputed angrily for some time, but as the nurse said she would go home, as the time was slipping away, and as his wheat would not come to the farmyard of its own accord, he agreed to her terms at last. "Very well, then, that is settled. 6 francs, including everything, until the corpse is taken out." "That is settled. 6 francs." And he went away with long strides to his wheat, which was lying on the ground under the hot sun which ripens the grain, while the sick nurse returned to the house. She had brought some work with her, for she worked without stopping by the side of the dead and dying, sometimes for herself, sometimes for the family, who employed her as a seamstress also, paying her rather more in that capacity. Suddenly she asked, "Have you received the last sacrament, Mother Bontemps?" The old peasant woman said no with her head, and La Rapette, who was very devout, got up quickly. "Good heavens, is it possible? I will go and fetch the cure." And she rushed off to the parsonage so quickly that the urchins in the street thought some accident had happened when they saw her trotting off like that. The priest came immediately in his surplice, preceded by a choir boy who rang a bell to announce the passage of the host through the parched and quiet country. Some men working at a distance took off their large hats and remained motionless until the white vestment had disappeared behind some farm buildings. The women who were making up the sheaves stood up to make the sign of the cross. The frightened black hens ran away along the ditch until they reached a well-known hole through which they suddenly disappeared, while a foal, which was tied up in the meadow, took fright at the sight of the surplice and began to gallop round at the length of its rope, kicking violently. The choir boy in his red cassock walked quickly, and the priest, the square beretta on his bowed head, followed him, muttering some prayers. Last of all came La Rapette, bent almost double, as if she wished to prostrate herself. She walked with folded hands, as if she were in church. Honoré saw them pass in the distance, and he asked, "Where is our priest going to?" And his man, who was more acute, replied, "Well, he's taking the sacrament to your mother, of course." The peasant was not surprised and said, "That is quite possible," and went on with his work. Mother Bontemps confessed, receiving absolution and extreme unction, and the priest took his departure, leaving the two women alone in the suffocating cottage. La Rapette began to look at the dying woman, and to ask herself whether it could last much longer. The day was on the wane, and a cooler air came in stronger puffs, making a view of a pennant, which was fastened to the wall by 2 pins, flap up and down. The scanty window curtains, which had formerly been white but were now yellow and covered with fly specks, looked as if it were going to fly off, and seemed to struggle to get away like the old woman's soul. Lying motionless with her eyes open, the old mother seemed to await the death which was so near, and which yet delayed its coming, with perfect indifference. Her short breath whistled in her throat. It would stop altogether soon, and there'd be one woman less in the world, one whom nobody would regret. At nightfall, Honoré returned, and when he went up to the bed and saw that his mother was still alive, he asked, "How is she?" just as he'd done formerly when she'd been sick. Then he sent La Rapette away, saying to her, "Tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock, without fail. And she replied, "Tomorrow at 5 o'clock." She came at daybreak and found Honoré eating his soup, which he had made himself before going to work. "Well, is your mother dead?" asked the nurse. "She's rather better, on the contrary," he replied, with a malignant look out of the corner of his eyes. Then he went out. La Rapette was seized with anxiety and went up to the dying woman, who was in the same state, lethargic and impassive, her eyes open and her hands clutching at the counterpane. The nurse perceived that this might go on thus for 2 days, 4 days, 8 days even, and her avaricious mind was seized with fear. She was excited to fury against the cunning fellow who had tricked her, against the woman who would not die. Nevertheless, she began to sew and waited with her eyes fixed on the wrinkled face of Mother Bontemps. When Honoré returned to breakfast, he seemed quite satisfied, and even in a bantering humor, for he was carrying in his wheat under his very favorable circumstances. La Rapette was getting exasperated. Every passing minute now seemed to her so much time and money stolen from her. She felt a mad inclination to choke this old ass, the headstrong old fool, this obstinate old wretch, to stop that short, rapid breath which was robbing her of time and money by squeezing her throat just a little. But then she reflected on the danger of doing so, and other thoughts came into her head. So she went up to the bed and said to her, "Have you ever seen the devil?" Mother Bontemps whispered, "No." Then the sick nurse began to talk, and to tell her tales likely to terrify her weak and dying mind. "Some minutes before one dies, the devil appears," she said, "to all. He has a broom in his hand, a saucepan on his head, and he utters loud cries. When anybody had seen him, all was over, and that person had only a few minutes longer to live." And she enumerated all those to whom the devil had appeared that year: Josephine Loisel, Eulalie Ratier, Sophie Padenau, Seraphine Grosbeet. Mother Bontemps, who was at last most disturbed in mind, moved about and wrung her hands, and tried to turn her head to look at the other end of the room. Suddenly La Rapette disappeared at the foot of the bed. She took a sheet out of the cupboard and wrapped herself up in it. Then she put the iron pot onto her head, so that its 3 short bent feet rose up like horns, took a broom in her right hand and a tin pail in her left, which she threw up suddenly, so it might fall to the ground noisily. Certainly when it came down, it made a terrible noise. Then climbing onto a chair, the nurse showed herself gesticulating and uttering shrill cries into the pot, which covered her face, while she menaced the old peasant woman, who was nearly dead with her broom. Terrified, with a mad look on her face, the dying woman made a superhuman effort to get up and escape. She even got her shoulders and chest out of bed. Then she fell back with a deep sigh. All was over, and La Rapette calmly put everything back into its place: the broom into the corner by the cupboard, the sheet inside it, the pot on the hearth, the pail onto the floor, and the chair against the wall. Then with a professional air she closed the dead woman's enormous eyes, put a plate on the bed, and poured some holy water into it, dipped a twig of boxwood into it, and kneeling down, she fervently repeated the prayers for the dead which she knew by heart, as a matter of business. When Honoré returned in the evening, he found her praying. He calculated immediately that she'd made 20 sous out of him, for she'd only spent 3 days and 1 night there, which made 5 francs altogether, instead of the 6 which he owed her.